Karambakuwa. The co-author is Roseline from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And the title of our presentation is Trade Structure as an Enabler of Economic Growth in Africa. So I'll start with an outline of my presentation. Firstly, I will discuss the introduction and objectives, followed by theoretical literature, empirical literature, methodology, empirical results, conclusions, policy implications, and finally, I'll discuss the limitations and direction for future research. There has been increasing importance of trade structure in determining trade and economic growth. However, empirical literature and policymakers have not given much attention to trade structure. Rather, trade openness and trade volume have been used.
That problem, I think, is breaking down. You know that. Let's.
Okay, can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, thank you. So I was saying, empirical literature and also policymakers have not given much attention to trade structure. Rather, trade openness and trade volume have been used to refer to trade. But these are affected by non-trade growth factors such as exchange rate. We therefore present the role of trade structure in enabling economic growth using data from 18 African countries. And these countries are from different regions. These are from different...
Is it okay now? Are you okay?
Yes, I am okay.
I think we can't hear you properly.
Okay. How about now?
Hello?
Hello,
yeah,
I can hear you.
It's breaking down. Maybe what you can do...
can you hear me?
There's a lot of interruption that we can't hear properly.
Okay.
Maybe you can just flip through the PowerPoint, the slides, hold it a couple of minutes, then we can see what is there. So once your system is stabilized, then you can maybe start explaining. Oh, it is okay now. It is okay now. Okay, carry on.
Oh, you can hear me now. So can I start over now? Hello, can you hear me now? Hello?
It's okay now. It's okay now.
Sorry, can anyone hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay,
yes.
So I'll continue from where I was. So I was saying, we therefore present the role of trade structure in enabling economic growth using data from 18 African countries. And these countries are from different regions with different levels of income. The first hypothesis is that trade structure does not enable growth in Africa. The second hypothesis, the standard explanatory variables do not enable economic growth in Africa. And the trade structure variables that we are looking at are the number of exported goods, concentration of trade, and intra-industry trade. So I'll start by looking at the first variable, which is the number of exported goods. This is shown on Fig 1. And basically, as shown on this diagram, there was an upward trajectory in the number of exported goods from 1988 right up to about 2000 to 2014. Then from there onwards, the number of exported goods started declining. Then the other trade structure variable that we are looking at is, besides the number of exported goods, is concentration of trade. As you can see from the diagram, there was a general decline in concentration of trade, and we use the HH index to measure concentration of trade. Hence, trade for African countries has been becoming less and less concentrated, implying an increasingly diversified trade portfolio. The other variable that we looked at is intra-industry trade, which we used the Grabolloid index to measure, and the diagram there shows that the intra-industry trade has been fluctuating with a peak between 2000 and 2003. In terms of theoretical literature, the major growth theories basically do not consider trade or trade structure as drivers of economic growth. That is the Solow model, neoclassical growth theory, and Roma and Lucas endogenous growth model. However, there are also theories that consider trade and trade structure as determinants of economic growth. These are the product cycle theory, the overlapping demands theory, and also economies of scale theory. Hence, they consider trade structure as determinants of economic growth. In terms of empirical literature, there are various findings on trade structure impact on economic growth. For example, there are findings on export concentration in that it reduces growth, whilst intra-industry trade increases growth. Also, there's a positive correlation which was found between the number of trade partners and also growth, especially for rich countries. Also, a positive correlation between trade concentration and growth, and positive relationship between intra-industry trade and also economic growth. So this is just some of the empirical literature pertaining trade structure and growth. Further, in terms of the methodology, we came up with this generalized equation whereby trade structure and the standard explanatory variables are the exogenous variables that determine gross domestic product. And then from this generalized equation, we came up with a specific equation shown as equation 2, whereby HH index and IIT index, and also number of exported products, gross capital formation, inflation, and population growth are tested to find out their significance in determination of gross domestic product. We used panel data fixed effects regression to estimate the model using data from 18 African countries for the period given, 1988 to 2017. And we used EVIFs to analyze our data. So to calculate intra-industry trade, as I've mentioned, we use the Grabolloid index, whereby if it is 0, then there's no intra-industry trade. If it is 1, then all trade is intra-industry. And then we use the HH index to measure concentration of trade, like I've mentioned. And when trade is concentrated to a very few markets, then the index is close to 1. And a perfectly diversified trade portfolio has an index close to 0. In terms of our data, we use the World Bank sources to obtain our data. We also carried out some tests on our data. For example, the Houseman test to prove that the fixed effects is the best estimation technique. We also checked for unit root using 2 different stationarity tests, and then we also did diagnostic tests to check for multicollinearity and joint significance, and also cross-section dependence. So we found that there's no evidence of multicollinearity, and that variables are jointly significant, and there's no serial correlation between the African countries. In terms of our empirical results, to check for robustness, even though our test showed that the fixed effects is the best estimation method, but to check for robustness, we present both fixed and random effects results. But for interpretation, we use the fixed effects results. So as shown here, our results indicate that trade concentration is not significant. Intra-industry trade is significant at 1% level. Number of exported products significant at 5%. Gross fixed capital formation significant at 1%. Inflation significant at 5%, but it is inversely related to GDP growth, whilst population growth is significant at 5% level. So from these results, we come up with the following conclusions. We conclude that trade structure is indeed an enabler of economic growth in Africa, and the trade structure variables, namely intra-industry trade and number of exported products, positively determine economic growth in Africa. Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis for these two variables. However, trade structure variable, namely concentration of trade, does not determine growth of African countries. Hence, we fail to reject the null for this variable. Further, we reject the null for the three standard explanatory variables, that is gross capital formation, population growth, and inflation. So the first two variables, gross capital formation and population growth, they positively determine economic growth, but inflation negatively determines economic growth in Africa. So from these conclusions, the following are the policy implications. The first one is that increased intra-industry trade between African countries can lead to economic growth as the countries benefit from specialization and economies of scale. Therefore, it makes economic sense for trade partners in Africa to promote growth of intra-industry trade between themselves. African countries have a higher chance of realizing growth if they increase the number of exported products. Thus, giving trade structure as much consideration as trade openness and volume may enable African countries to realize faster economic growth. Then, growth in domestic investment and also population may lead to economic growth. However, care must be taken to ensure that there is a balance between population growth and also resource availability. And also it's important to impart necessary skills to the labor force. And also finally, inflation needs to be controlled as it can retard the growth of African economies. There are some limitations that we face and also some recommendations on direction for future research. The major limitation was availability of data for some African countries. Hence, we had used 18 out of the total of 54 countries, which is 33%. Then in future, research could focus on comparison of trade structure impact on growth, perhaps between regions in Africa. For example, comparison of West African region and Southern African region. With that, I come to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention.